don't know the world you're living in.
Welcome to the future.
Welcome again. I am the Gadfly sent by God to rouse you from your slumber, and this week I intend to do something very similar to last week's episode on how to live a good life with lessons from Stoicism. But this week I'll try to do the same thing with existentialism. Now, I'm not a complete existentialist because there are many things about the philosophy that I dislike. I think it can be unnecessarily dangerous, for example, and I think it begins from a few misguided assumptions and reaches some conclusions that don't necessarily follow. In fact, I would caution anybody against being completely dogmatic in regards to any one school of philosophy. If you think just because you agree with a few ideas that you have to accept the whole philosophy, part and parcel, then you're likely not thinking critically enough to be able to sift out the intellectual gold from the dirt. The nice thing is that existentialism is a mixed bag of philosophers who not only disagreed with the status quo philosophers of their time, but also disagreed with each other. However, it has been one of the most influential schools of philosophy in my life, and some existential philosophers hit the nail on the head, so to speak, really grappling with the most significant problems of the human condition, like freedom, despair, our relation to the people and the world around us, the role of philosophy in our lives, and what it means to live authentically. With all that being said, it's fitting to start off with Soren Kierkegaard. So let's get into it. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forward, he said. This is a rather popular quote, and a lot has already been said about it by others. But I just want to add or reinforce what a statement like this can do for us in our everyday lives. To break it down, this quote contains two parts, a description and a prescription, or a statement of fact and a statement about what ought to be. The first part suggests that as life happens to us, it is, or can be, unintelligible and disorienting. It's only when a moment passes us and we have put some distance between us and the seminal event that we can look at it from a more sober perspective. Once it has passed us, we can make a well-reasoned decision about what to do and how to handle that type of situation. But the problem is that such a moment is gone and new events are continually upon us. When coupled together, these two parts of the statement suggest that life is going to be pretty disorienting and sometimes nonsensical, but we must get through it. Even if we don't understand why, we must live on because the answer will likely be much clearer when the storm is behind us. For anybody who has done more reading of Kierkegaard, this echoes his teleological suspension of the ethical, but we won't go into that here. I'll simply state that sometimes we have to suspend the idea that we know the right thing to do and simply do something with the best hope and faith that such an action in the moment was right. And, God willing, the answer will be clearer to us in the future. As such, we shouldn't relentlessly beat ourselves up about what we ought to have done or could have done. But instead, we should understand that we now can and now must act. This leads me to the next idea of existentialist philosophy that I think can help us live better, and that is the general notion of freedom. Several existentialist philosophers have talked about this, and many of them have used it in different ways, but the idea suggests several things to me. First, we are independent of anything other than our choices. What I mean to say there is that no matter what we have done up until the moment of our choice, we are free to choose from any of the possibilities before us. I will admit we do not have an infinite quantity of choices, but most existentialist philosophers want to show us that we have many more than we think are possible. This can range from the mundane to the grandiose, but in our lives, we are rarely without several choices. For example, you are expected by society, your boss, the rules of etiquette and proper behavior, to show up to work tomorrow, on time, not give your boss any grief, do your work, and punch out, having satisfied the desires of your employer. But you could quit. You don't have to give a 2 weeks notice. You could make a spectacle of it, or you could simply never show up again. You could continue to go to your job, or you could run off to live in the woods, move to another city, pack up, abandon your home, hike across the country. All of the job references, the decent thing to do, the obligations, or acting like a responsible adult are mere excuses created in bad faith. We use bad faith as a means to limit our radical freedom. Bad faith is what tells us it is irresponsible to quit a job without having another one lined up, or without giving a proper notice, because after all, that might affect our future references. Exposing our bad faith questions the underlying assumption that we even want to have another job. If we are not the type of person for whom a 9 to 5 is rewarding, then we are lying to ourselves every time we search for one. We are lying to ourselves every time we punch in. We are lying to ourselves when we suggest that society has deemed this normal and good, and therefore it's good for us too. Existentialism, with its emphasis on radical freedom, demands that every person consider himself an individual in every aspect of his life. Society might think something good or beneficial, but that which helps operate a society is not necessarily that which is good for an individual who has no desire to be part of a uniformly gray society. When we understand that we are free, that we don't have to do anything that society demands of us, we can start to see how we ought to live our lives. When we keep in mind that we will die soon, after all, another 40 or 50 years isn't that long, we start to realize that we simply don't have time to placate people whose only goal is to keep us in line and keep order for order's sake. We decide to live authentically. And that's my third insight from existentialist philosophy. Our life is comprised of choices. Quite literally, every moment is a choice, and every moment becomes a day, which becomes a year, which becomes our life in total. Because we are individuals, and our choices are made by us, we ought to make those choices which bring us closer to our goal. This does not mean that you ought to be inconsiderate of other people, but it does not demand that you necessarily be considerate of them either, nor does it demand that you make sacrifices for them. This is one of the areas of existentialism which can lead a person to complete nihilism or moral relativism. In my own personal life, I temper this vicious descent with stoic virtue ethics, which you can find in a previous video. Basically, a good life can be had by developing virtues because virtues help you decide what is the appropriate thing to do, not merely according to societal norms, but rather according to what will most likely remove suffering and strife from your life and allow you to excel as a human being. But if you can safely navigate between complete nihilism and complete conformity, both of which serve to be your destruction, existential authenticity offers you a much wider range of options outside of the box that society wants to place you in. To briefly sum this video up, we must act as individuals, even when the road ahead is unclear and disorienting. Our actions are, by nature, free and without restraint, except for those restraints that we choose to put on them. How we act determines who we are, and therefore we should only choose those restraints which serve to forge us into our most authentic selves. Thank you for watching as always. I appreciate the feedback in the comments, positive and negative. Although you have freedom, you do not have freedom to not like this video. That's something I'm forcing you to do. Likewise, do what's expected of you and subscribe to be notified when next week's episode airs.
They were meant seen, either that or everyone else's.